was close to midnight when I got to Fran's diner. I'd been working the night shift for a few months now, but tonight felt different. The air was thick with fog that seemed to press against the diner's windows, like it was trying to get in. The neon sign outside kept flickering, buzzing like it was ready to give up. Everything felt off, but I just shrugged it off as one of those nights. I didn't think much about it until things started getting strange. The diner was empty when I got in, just me and Jim, the cook. Jim had been working at Fran's longer than anyone. He was a quiet guy, the kind who kept to himself, and tonight he seemed even more distant. He was standing by the grill, flipping burgers that nobody had ordered yet, lost in thought. I gave him a nod, but he barely looked up. I hung up my coat, put on my apron, and got ready to start my shift. Around 12:15, 3 men walked in. They were dressed in black, all serious and quiet, like they'd come from a funeral. They sat down at the counter and ordered coffee, no food, just coffee. I poured it for them, and they each took a cup, sipping silently while staring out the window at the fog. They didn't talk, just sat there with their eyes fixed on something in the darkness. I got the feeling they were waiting for something or someone. I was curious, sure, but I wasn't about to ask. An hour passed, and nobody else came in. The clock ticked slowly, and the diner was quiet. Even the usual hum of the fridge and the soft clink of dishes seemed muted. Then, just as I started to relax, the door creaked open, and a man stepped in. He was tall and thin, with a face that looked worn out and eyes that seemed older than he was. There was a strange smell about him, like damp earth mixed with something metallic. He didn't pay any attention to the 3 men. He just nodded at me and asked for a booth in the back. I took him to the booth and got him a black coffee, no sugar. He didn't touch it. He just sat there, staring at the wall, lost in thought. I wondered what had brought him here, but at this hour, I figured he was just another night owl passing through. A little after 1, the door opened again, and a family came in. They looked like they'd been traveling for a while, a mother, a father, and a little girl with long dark hair. The mother's eyes looked strange, distant, like she was staring through me. The father looked tired, and the little girl just sat quietly, not moving or fidgeting like most kids would. I showed them to a booth, and they ordered drinks. But as I poured their sodas, I noticed none of them seemed to drink or eat. They just sat there, all 3 of them, silent and still. I tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine, but I couldn't help it. The diner felt cold, almost empty, even though there were people around. It was like the warmth of the place had vanished, leaving only the chill of the fog pressing in against the glass. Then, at exactly 2, the lights went out. The entire diner went pitch black. I fumbled for my flashlight, and I heard Jim mutter a curse from the kitchen. I finally found the flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the room. The diner was silent, dead silent. Even the buzz of the sign outside had stopped, and I realized I couldn't hear anything, not even the hum of the fridge. When the light from my flashlight hit the booth where the family was sitting, I noticed something strange. The mother, the father, and the little girl were all sitting perfectly still, staring at me with blank eyes. The little girl's mouth moved, barely a whisper, but I heard her words clear as day. "He's here." A chill ran through me, and I stumbled back, my heart pounding. "Who's here?" I whispered, but she just stared, her face pale and empty. I backed away slowly, not taking my eyes off her. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the flashlight. The lights flickered back on a second later, and everything seemed normal again, or as normal as it could be. The hum of the fridge returned, and the buzz of the sign outside started up again. I breathed a sigh of relief, but when I looked around, I realized Jim was gone. His apron was still hanging on the hook, but he was nowhere to be seen. I walked back to the dining area, hoping Jim had just stepped outside for a smoke. But I felt an odd emptiness, a hollow silence that told me something wasn't right. The 3 men in black were still sitting at the counter, their coffee cups untouched. The family sat still, their hands folded neatly on the table, staring straight ahead, and the stranger in the back booth had vanished. The front door swung open, and I turned, expecting to see Jim, or maybe a customer. But it was the stranger, the tall man with the tired eyes. He had a strange smile on his face now, like he knew something I didn't. He looked around the diner, his gaze landing on the family, then the 3 men in black, and finally me. "Seems like it's my turn," he said, his voice low and cold. He walked over to the family, and as he got closer, they all turned to look at him, their eyes dull and lifeless. The stranger reached out, placing a hand on the father's shoulder. The family stood up, all at once, like they were following some unspoken command. They moved in sync, their faces blank, as they followed the man out of the diner without a word. The three men in black stood up next, nodding to the stranger as they left, one by one, each stepping into the fog outside. I watched them disappear, my heart racing, feeling like I was in some kind of nightmare. I wanted to say something, to shout or call out, but no sound came out. I was frozen in place, watching as they all vanished into the mist. When they were gone, the diner felt empty, emptier than it should have. It was like a part of the place had been taken, leaving behind a strange, hollow silence. I walked over to the booth where the stranger had sat, hoping to find some clue, something to explain what had just happened. There, on the table, was a crumpled-up newspaper clipping. I picked it up and unfolded it with trembling hands. It was an obituary, dated years ago. The picture was of a family, the same family that had just walked out of the diner. They'd been killed in a car accident late at night, just a few miles down the road. The article said they died instantly, but that their bodies had disappeared before the authorities could reach the scene. No one ever figured out where they went. I don't know what happened that night at Fran's diner. I don't know if it was ghosts or demons, or if I was just dreaming. But when I came back the next night, the diner was closed for good. Jim never showed up, and no one in town seemed to remember him, or the family, or the three men in black. It was like they'd all been erased from everyone's memory, like they'd just vanished into thin air. Now, whenever I drive past that empty diner, I see the flickering sign and remember that night. Sometimes, I think I see shapes moving in the fog, shadows of people walking along the road. But I don't stop. I just keep driving, hoping that whatever I saw that night stays where it belongs, in the dark. Charlie's diner buzzed faintly, casting an unsettling glow over the cracked pavement. I pulled into the parking lot just after midnight, the only car for miles around. I'd been driving for hours, and the diner was the only place I could find open at this hour. As I stepped inside, a wave of warmth hit me, contrasting sharply with the chilly night air. The diner was surprisingly cozy, with red vinyl booths and a checkered floor. The smell of fried food and coffee hung heavily in the air. I approached the counter, where a woman with tired eyes stood wiping down the surface. Her name tag read, Maggie, and she looked up with a weary smile. "Welcome to Charlie's. What can I get you?" she asked. "Just a coffee, please," I replied, taking a seat at the counter. As I waited, I glanced around the diner. It was decorated with old photographs of smiling families and faded memorabilia. The walls seemed to absorb the chatter and laughter of days long past. But tonight, the only sound was the low hum of the fridge in the back. Maggie poured my coffee, and as she slid it across the counter, I noticed her hands were shaking slightly. "You all right?" I asked, concerned. She hesitated before answering. "Just a rough night. We don't get many customers this late. You're the first one in." I nodded, but something in her voice hinted at more. "Anything weird happen?" Her eyes darted to the entrance. "Just the usual. You know how it is. But it's been strange." Before I could ask what she meant, the door swung open with a creak, and in walked a man. He was tall, with a long coat that looked out of place in the diner. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, making it hard to see his features. He settled into a booth at the far end, his movements slow and deliberate. Maggie stiffened as she watched him. "He comes in here every now and then, just sits and stares," she said quietly. "Should I be worried?" I asked, half joking. She shrugged. "It's just something about him." I took a sip of my coffee, trying to shake off the tension in the air. The man didn't look like he was doing anything wrong. He just sat there, staring out the window at the fog that swirled outside. I was curious about him but didn't want to seem rude, so I focused on my coffee. After a few minutes, Maggie moved to the back to grab something. I glanced at the man again. He hadn't moved, still staring out into the dark. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping up my spine, the sense that something wasn't right. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the kitchen, and I jumped in my seat. I looked back to see Maggie rushing out, her face pale. "I'm so sorry. Just a pot falling," she said. But her eyes darted back to the man. I turned to see him now looking directly at us, his gaze piercing through the shadows. There was something unsettling about his eyes, something that made me feel exposed. I wanted to look away, but I was frozen, caught in his stare. Maggie cleared her throat. I need to check on the grill, just a moment. She hurried into the kitchen, leaving me alone with the man. As the seconds ticked by, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down. I turned back to my coffee, trying to focus on anything else. Then I heard the man speak, his voice low and gravelly. Do you believe in second chances? I looked up, startled. He leaned forward, his hat casting a shadow over his face. Second chances. Some people think they're impossible. Others believe they can be found in the most unexpected places. I guess it depends on the situation, I replied, trying to keep the conversation light. He chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. You're in a place that's seen a lot of second chances. People come here when they're lost, looking for something, but sometimes they don't find what they expect. Before I could respond, Maggie reappeared, a plate in her hands. What can I get you? She asked the man, trying to maintain her composure. Just a glass of water, please, he replied without taking his eyes. Maggie nodded and hurried to the sink. I could feel the tension between the two of them, as if there was something unspoken hanging in the air. As she filled a glass with water, I leaned closer to the man. What do you mean by second chances? I asked, my curiosity overtaking my caution. He paused as if weighing his words. Every choice we make leads us down a path. Sometimes we end up where we never intended. It's easy to get trapped in a cycle, but this diner… He glanced around, lowering his voice. It has a way of breaking those cycles, if you're… Maggie returned with the water, placing it in front of him, her hands trembling slightly. Here you go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Thank you, he replied, taking a slow sip. Is there anything else I can get you? Maggie asked, avoiding his gaze. No, I'm just here for a while, he said, his eyes narrowing. Until my meal is ready. I asked, confused. He turned his attention back to me, a slow smile spreading across his face. The meal that brings… I glanced at Maggie, who looked more anxious than ever. What do you mean? I pressed, feeling a mix of fear and intrigue. But before he could respond, the diner door swung open again, and a group of 4 people burst in, laughing and joking as if they owned the place. They were loud and cheerful, completely unaware of the tension that had settled in the room. Maggie visibly relaxed, her shoulders dropping. Thank goodness, she murmured, hurrying over to the new customer. I watched as the man in the booth scowled at the newcomers, his demeanor shifting. It was as if the laughter had pierced the bubble of darkness he'd wrapped himself. Do you think they'll be okay? I asked, nodding toward the group. He leaned back, his eyes darkening again. Not everyone who enters this diner leaves unchanged, he said cryptically. Sometimes they carry burdens they can't shake off. The newcomers took a seat at the counter, oblivious to the strange atmosphere. They ordered food and coffee, filling the diner with noise and laughter. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. But the man's words echoed in my mind. Maggie was now serving the new customers, and the diner felt alive again. But I couldn't shake the unease. I glanced at the man in the booth, who was watching the group with an intense gaze. It was as if he was sizing them up, waiting for something to happen. After a few minutes, the laughter started to die down. The man finally broke the silence. Watch closely, he said, his voice low. You'll see what happens when the past catches up with… I frowned, unsure of what he meant. Just then, one of the newcomers, a young woman with bright red hair, turned to face the man. Are you going to eat something or just sit there? She asked, her tone playful but laced with an edge. He didn't reply, just stared at her with an unsettling calm. The atmosphere in the diner shifted again, the laughter fading as an awkward tension filled the space. The woman's smile faltered under his gaze, and the others started to look uncomfortable. Suddenly, the man leaned forward, his eyes flashing. You think you can escape your past? You can't run from it. It always finds a way to catch up. His voice was low, almost a growl. Maggie rushed over, her eyes wide with fear. Please, just leave them alone, she pleaded. Why? He snapped, his voice rising. They need to know what's coming. The young woman looked confused, and the rest of her friends shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I felt my heart race. What do you mean? I asked, trying to keep the situation from escalating. Sometimes the diner serves more than food, he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. Sometimes it serves justice. Before I could respond, the lights flickered and dimmed, casting strange shadows across the diner. The laughter turned to nervous chatter, and I could see panic flickering in the eyes of the new. "What's happening?" the red-haired woman asked, her voice rising in fear. Maggie backed away, her hands trembling. "This isn't good," she whispered. "Not good at all." The man in the booth laughed softly, a dark, chilling sound. "You thought you could come here and escape? The diner remembers. It always remembers." The lights flickered again, and when they came back on, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The diner was filled with a heavy silence, and the laughter had vanished. The newcomers looked pale and terrified, as if they were seeing something we couldn't. "What's going on?" one of the men in the group shouted, his voice cracking. "Just wait," the man in the booth said, his voice a low rumble. "You'll find out soon enough." Suddenly, the diner's phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the tension. Maggie dashed to answer it, but as she picked up, her expression shifted to one of horror. "No, no!" she gasped, dropping the phone. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. "The police," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're on their way." The man in the booth smiled wider, his eyes gleaming with something dark. "Good. Let them come. They can't help you now." The newcomers were frozen, their faces pale as they exchanged frantic glances. I felt a surge of dread wash over me. "What do you want?" I asked, desperate. He leaned back, relishing my fear. "I want them to face the truth they've been running from." Before I could process his words, the diner door swung open again, and a police officer stepped inside. He looked around, confused by the tense atmosphere. "What's going on here?" he asked, his hand resting on his holster. Maggie rushed over, tears in her eyes. "We need help. There's something wrong with him." She pointed to the man in the booth. The officer's gaze landed on the man, and for a moment, it felt like the air was charged with electricity. The man didn't flinch. He just stared back, a cold smile on his lips. The officer approached cautiously. "Sir, I need you to step outside," he said, his voice firm. The man laughed, a dark, echoing sound. "You think you can take me out of here? This diner is my domain." Before anyone could react, the lights flickered again, and the officer's expression shifted from confusion to horror. "What's happening?" he shouted, but it was too late. The lights went out completely, plunging the diner into darkness. In the pitch black, I could hear shuffling, whispers, and muffled cries. I stumbled around, trying to find something solid to hold on to. Then, with a flash, the lights returned, but the scene before me was unrecognizable. The man was no longer sitting in the booth. The four newcomers were standing, frozen in fear, their faces pale as if they had seen a ghost. The officer stood in the center of the diner, looking confused, as if he had just walked into a different world. "What just happened?" he asked, glancing around in disbelief. Maggie's voice trembled. He was just here. He was going to tell Tom, but the man was gone. The booth was empty, and the air felt thick with tension, as if something dark had seeped into the walls of the diner. The officer frowned. "We got a call about some disturbances. Is everyone all right?" We don't know," I stammered, my heart racing. "He said something about justice." The officer looked at the newcomers, who were visibly shaken. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer now. One of the men finally spoke up, his voice shaky. "We don't know what we saw. He was just sitting there, and then everything changed." Maggie stepped forward. "He warned them. He said they couldn't escape their past." The officer's expression darkened. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" But before she could explain, the lights flickered again, and this time, they didn't come back on. The diner was plunged into darkness once more, and I could hear the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. "Everyone stay calm," the officer shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the darkness. I felt my way toward the counter, trying to find something to hold on to. Then, out of the shadows, I heard the man's voice again, low and mocking. "You can't escape. The diner knows all your secrets." I felt a chill run down my spine. The laughter of the newcomers had turned into panic as they scrambled for the door, but the man's laughter echoed around us, growing louder. The lights flickered one last time, and in that brief flash, I saw him again, standing right by the booth, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. "Welcome to your reckoning," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Then darkness enveloped us once. When the lights came back on, everything had changed. The diners were gone, the police officer was nowhere to be seen, and it was just me and Maggie left in the diner. When the lights came back, Maggie was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What just happened?" she whispered. I didn't know how to answer. I looked out the window, but the fog had thickened, obscuring everything outside. The diner felt more isolated than ever, and an unsettling silence enveloped us. I didn't know. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice shaking. Maggie shook her head. "I don't think so. I think we're still here. We just don't know it yet." I turned back to the booth where the man had been sitting. The shadows seemed to linger there, and I felt a cold breeze sweep through the diner. As I sat there, sipping my now cold coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that the diner held secrets that would never be revealed. I glanced at Maggie, and we both understood that we had become part of something much darker than we could have imagined. And so, we waited in the silence of Charlie's diner, wondering if anyone would ever walk through the door again, or if we were trapped in our own second chance, doomed to relive the horrors of that night forever.